So today I want to talk about the impact of misinformation, particularly science misinformation in the cosmetic space and beyond what might be obvious. So a couple of statistics that might surprise you, but it really sets the stage for why we struggle with combating misinformation is the fact that only 28% of Americans are considered scientifically literate. And in the context of this, we're talking about civic science literacy, where civic science literacy is not simply just taking in information and understanding it, but it's knowing where to find credible information, how to make sense of it, how to use that information to actually engage in discussion or making decisions based on it. And that includes voting for things or having conversations with your legislators who are actually the ones that make policy and law. So only 22% of high school graduates are considered civically scientifically literate. And this is lower if you look at people with just a high school diploma. But on the flip side, 52% of adults consider themselves interested in science and technology issues. And so this disparity is obviously problematic because if people are interested in it, but only 28% of the population can appropriately interpret and make decisions on it, it means that those individuals may be relying on misinformation, either intentionally or not. So when we think about what underpins cosmetics information and really all science and health misinformation, it really relates to this idea of chemophobia, which is the irrational fear of chemicals. And this chemophobia causes people to believe that chemicals are inherently harmful, no matter the dosage, no matter the exposure, no matter the route of exposure, no matter the species. And everything is chemicals, right? We are sacks of chemicals. Water is a chemical, air is a mixture of chemicals. And so we really need to get people to view chemicals in the scope of context, right? Any chemical can theoretically be harmful at a certain exposure, even things that are essential for life. But often you'll hear messaging related to wanting natural ingredients, or people can't pronounce certain chemicals or ingredients, or they say they don't want things like preservatives or additives, right? Added chemicals. And these really play into this appeal to nature fallacy and the appeal to emotion. And so what ends up happening is that people falsely believe that naturally derived substances are automatically better, safer, ecologically friendly, that things added to substances or products are inherently harmful when we're adding those things for a good reason. And the fact that a chemical has a very long, complex name, which to scientists helps us understand how it's structured and what groups are attached to it. Those things really exploit that low science literacy and this chemophobia. And so chemophobia is further exacerbated by media articles that don't present context. They're just making these kind of blanket statements without nuance. And what they're doing is they're using confirmation bias. People are reading these and they're like, see, I told you, these things were toxic. I told you these things were harmful. And it really exacerbates and enhances that fear. And that fear makes people less likely to actually listen to nuance and fact. Beyond that, the general public is unlikely to fact check after reading something, especially if that evokes emotion. And so we saw that in the context of the California AB 418, where they banned red dye 3, and every single media headline was saying red dye 3 is banned in Europe, but it's not. A simple fact check would have explained to people that it uses a different name because it's regulated by the European Food Safety Authority, and they name food colorings differently. It's called E127 in Europe. And of course, people are more fearful of human risks, human-made risks, especially things that are synthetic, because of this appeal to nature fallacy. And that's particularly true when you're talking about, things that you're putting in or on your body, or decisions that you're making that you feel like you have direct control over. And yes, there are organizations, I'm looking at you, the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Reports and Children's Health Defense, who actively profit by promoting misinformation. They make money for themselves, they make money for their donors, they make money for their vested interests by scaring people about things that we don't actually need to be scared by. So I want to talk about parabens because they're such a good case study in this sort of health misinformation space. So parabens are a class of chemicals. They're multiple different chemicals, and they're esters of 4-hydroxybenzoic acid. What ends up happening is that we remove this alcohol group and we replace it with an ester, which is an oxygen, with these different functional groups. So you have methylparaben, which has a methyl group, ethylparaben, an ethyl group, propylparaben, a propyl group, and so on and so forth. But these are all different chemicals. It's like saying mushrooms are harmful when we say parabens are harmful, because each of them are different, even though they're in the same bucket. And so we know that not all mushrooms are harmful. There are some that are harmful at certain doses, and there are plenty that are perfectly safe, even if we eat a lot of them. And so we need to view chemicals broadly in the same sort of context and nuance. But these are important preservatives that prevent bacterial and fungal contamination in products, and they've been used in products, cosmetics, medical, since the 1920s. We've really had no consequences from these. Unfortunately, the rise of social media and this kind of expansion of the appeal to nature fallacy that really kind of goes along with the unregulated wellness industry has led to this expansion of this clean beauty industry that claims things are chemical free or they're not filled with toxic chemicals, yet the chemicals they use are better. But it really placed this scrutiny on chemicals in formulations. And so this really accelerated with this study that was wildly misrepresented that came out in 2004 in the Journal of Applied Toxicology. And so what the study actually looked at, and this was really where the fear was fueled, was they basically took 20 different breast tumor biopsies, they digested them, and they used analytical chemistry techniques to look for trace levels of these 6 different parabens in question in these breast tissues. And what they found was there was really small levels of these things. And we're looking at this in units of nanogram per gram, which is, in other words, called parts per billion. So the first thing is that this whole study was based on correlation, not causation. These were breast samples that existed already, and these researchers kind of took them and were like, well, let's see what we can find in them. On top of that, there were no healthy controls. They didn't have healthy breast tissue to compare to. They didn't have healthy any other tissue to compare to. So they're making these insinuations that somehow these parabens are related to the breast cancer because they were found in the breast tumor. But there's no way to actually say that because it wasn't related to stage of disease. It wasn't related to exposure relative to diagnosis. These were biopsies that were just like in storage, and there was really no contextual information, and you couldn't even standardize or normalize to healthy tissue because those weren't included. They also took all of those 6 different chemicals and just kind of added them up. And like I said, these are different chemicals. They have different interactions. They have different functions. And they made these assumptions about how these are probably related to breast cancer because parabens have this estrogenic impact. But if we think about these levels that we're looking at, these are minuscule levels that have no biological relevance. For context, a part per billion is the same as 1 second of time across 31.7 years. So just think about that scale for a minute. That this study really was grabbed by the reins and exploited people's health anxiety because we're talking about hormone disruption. We're talking about cancer, especially breast cancer. We're talking about these chemicals that are in cosmetic products, and it really exploits that chemophobia. So what's real? Parabens have what we call weak estrogenic activity, which means they can mimic estrogens weakly. This is going to be important. So this is estrogen signaling. I'm not going to get into it, but estrogens bind estrogen receptor, and this leads to downstream phenomenon like cell survival and growth and reproduction. And so these terms that you hear like hormone disruptors or endocrine disruptors are basically things that can mimic a hormone and can interfere with these signaling pathways. But the weak part is really important because first, parabens, as soon as they get into your body, they're rapidly metabolized into that precursor, that hydroxybenzoic acid, and that's excreted in urine. And so a lot of studies that look at paraben levels, they're looking at excreted urine, which isn't an indication of what's being absorbed. It's literally an indication of what's being flushed out as a waste product. But on top of that, when we say it's weak estrogenic activity, When we look at estradiol, which is one of our biofunctional versions of estrogen, the binding affinity to estrogen receptor of estradiol is 100,000 times higher than ethylparaben and methylparaben. And it's 10,000 times fold higher than butylparaben and propylparaben. So when we say it's weak, it is not something that we need to be concerned about, especially at the levels of parabens that we would find in products. It's not out competing estrogens. It's not going to be clinically interfering with this sort of pathway. So what do the data actually say when we're thinking about how parabens impact us? So the reality is there's hundreds of studies that have examined the safety, the toxicology, the potential long-term impacts of parabens. And these include animal studies, toxicological testing, epidemiological studies, clinical trials, and regulatory reviews. And they have all concluded that parabens, especially at the levels we would be exposed to, are perfectly safe. There's actually an acceptable daily intake for parabens, which is 10 milligrams per kilogram, and that's ingestion. That's not even using them on your skin and skin products, and that's per day. So say a person weighs 70 kilograms, they would have to consume nearly a gram of parabens every single day. Now we're talking about topical application on our skin. When we're using these products, the concentrations of parabens that are needed to inhibit that microbial contamination really don't exceed 0.3%. So that's 0.3 grams per 100 grams of product. Pretty much have to bathe in a tub of these products to have any sort of potential risk. A lot of the studies when they talk about these reproductive issues and these hormone signaling issues, this is really when we're looking at animal studies that are being force-fed parabens or compounds containing parabens for long periods of time. And these studies are looking at orders of magnitude higher dosage. All global safety agencies that assess these sorts of compounds have all concluded that parabens that are used in cosmetics are safe at levels we would be exposed to. Unfortunately, misinformation continues to circulate. The misinformation ecosystem is really exploited by a few different factors. You have media amplifying these stories or these studies that are being taken out of context that are not representing the reality of the study. You have misinterpretation of science. As wonderful as it might be, everyone cannot do their own research. Everyone, even in the science field, has a niche, an area of expertise. And outside of that, it can be really difficult to critically analyze data because if you're not familiar with the research model being used, you can't even interpret whether it's relevant to the study they're conducting. Oftentimes, we have people using the wrong experts. So for example, particularly in the cosmetic space, we often have dermatologists who maybe are not as well versed with the chemistry of products that make fear-based claims that can scare people. Because it's this appeal to authority, they're a clinical provider, it can cause undue and unfounded fear. You have the clean beauty movement, which makes a lot of money marketing fear. Oftentimes it's positioned as paraben-free, is safer. And then, of course, we have the social media landscape where you have influencers who are given product or paid to promote products or disseminate fear-based messages. We're plagued with headlines and stories that are insinuating, oh, parabens are linked to hypertension and pregnancy. Americans are being poisoned. We need to ban parabens, paraben-free face washes. Parabens are skincare nasties. You should be avoiding these ingredients. And this one actually came from a dermatologist where they say that parabens are one of no ingredients, but there's actually no data to demonstrate this at all. It's really all based in this chemophobia. When you're thinking about the misinformation landscape, it goes beyond just this is false. It starts with the media sensationalism, and it really branches out from there. And this is going to underscore the far-reaching impacts. From there, the media sensationalism leads to the spread of misinformation. That spread of misinformation causes consumer fears. That consumer fear leads to public outcry. The public outcry drives market demand for companies to now make things that don't include these chemicals that people are scared of. Raw material suppliers, you have formulation chemists, you have companies that are trying to figure out a way to produce a similar product that performs similarly, is similarly safe, is similarly effective. It's very often the case that if they're looking at a replacement, it's not going to have as much data. If companies do reformulate, it legitimizes that misinformation. And it's not because it's science, it's because consumers are saying, I want this product. And companies are trying to balance what's science-based and what people will purchase. That legitimization leads to the implementation of things that are anti-science, policies, laws, bans of certain chemicals that will then lead to interference with regulatory oversight and the ability of toxicologists and regulatory experts to be able to autonomously evaluate safety of these compounds. And yes, it can impact other industries as well. This can actually worsen health outcomes and economic outcomes. So in the case of parabens, forced reformulation because of public outcry and unfounded fears has led to a couple of replacements. One example is phenoxyethanol. Phenoxyethanol is used as a preservative. It's an antimicrobial, but it's not as effective against fungi. It's only really effective against bacteria. So if you need to have a product like going to resist the growth of all pathogenic microorganisms, you need to include other chemicals. It's actually less stable than parabens, so you have to augment it with other stabilizers. So it needs higher concentrations compared to parabens for similar efficacy, and it's more expensive as a baseline. Now you have an increased cost of raw materials, increased cost of manufacture, and increased cost to you, the consumer. So now you're paying more for something that is maybe not as good and certainly not superior. Another example is methyl isothiazolinone, or MIT. This is one that was also used as a replacement as a result of paraben fears. And similar to phenoxyethanol, it's less effective against fungi, so it needs to be added with other antimicrobials. It is less expensive, but because it needs to be combined, now your total cost is probably equivalent. But the big issue here is that MIT is actually less safe. MIT has high allergenic potential compared to parabens. And so these switches in these products to MIT based on this public outcry actually led to an increase of dermatologic allergies. So you're actually legitimizing it and you're worsening the health of people's skin as a result. Then you have the other side of the coin where you have preservative-free products. So people are like, well, we don't want to include parabens because that word is scary. So we just won't include preservatives. Now, there's an obvious risk here because these are products that people are using over time. They're opening, they're closing, they're reusing, they're putting their hands in it. There's very obvious sources of contamination with pathogenic microorganisms. So this can lead to skin infections, eye infections, and systemic illness. So there's been a lot of examples of this, but a few that I want to call out. The Yes to Baby carrot wipes in 2013, they had severe contamination with Burkholderia cepacia, bacteria that can be really, really serious, especially in immunocompromised people. And yes, that includes children, infants, which these products were designed for. Honest Company had baby powder and it was preservative free. And this was recalled because of microbial contamination. Burt's Bees baby wipes had various contaminants, including Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Pseudomonas fluorescens, and Enterobacter gergovii. Because of lack of preservatives, all of these can cause serious human illness. Beauty Counter baby oil was contaminated with Staph aureus. Staph aureus can cause serious skin infections, impetigo, but even more systemic infections like sepsis and cellulitis. Baby Ganex, they market as free from harmful chemicals. They had preservative-free baby wipes and lotions. These had bacterial contamination. Because of this growth of these indie, these small beauty brands, these green products, these clean products, there have actually been quite a few recalls from pathogenic bacteria like Staphylococcus epidermidis, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and these are actually global. So regulatory agencies have really had to step in and reiterate that preservatives are critically important to maintain product safety of cosmetics and of skincare. And that's particularly true for things that you're frequently opening and closing in moist environments where fungi and bacteria like to thrive, like things that you might store in a bathroom. And the problem again here is that this reformulation is giving legitimacy to this claim that parabens are inherently harmful. Impacts go beyond the beauty space because parabens are not just used in skincare and cosmetics. And this is really the harm of the misinformation is you have a situation where you've demonized a product, that you think only exists in a single industry, but it's going to impact a lot of different things that we interact with on a daily basis. In the context of medical products, we use parabens for preservatives for things like topical creams, ointments, eye drops, and injectable medications. And so the same public outcry and misinformation in the cosmetic space has forced a lot of companies to reformulate, even though there's no evidence to support these claims about parabens. We're thinking of antifungal creams, corticosteroids, and antibiotic ointments, pharmaceuticals, there's injectable medications. There are certain multi-use vaccines that used parabens. Most of those are in developing nations. And you have a lot of ophthalmic products, especially contact lens solutions and eye drops. And you've had similar issues with contamination as a result of these reformulations. Keratitis, which is inflammation and infection of the cornea, this can actually lead to blindness. And there's been several outbreaks from eye drops that were manufactured without preservatives as a result. Cellulitis, sepsis, and other infections. This misinformation landscape is beyond just, oh, my lotion doesn't have paraben, my shampoo doesn't have parabens, it has really broad implications. How do we combat this misinformation? If you're a scientist, if you're a scientific expert, or if you're a health expert, we have to make a greater effort to discuss things. We have to discuss the limitations and the relevance of expertise. If you're not an appropriate expert and someone seeks you for guidance, refer them to a relevant expert. None of us are experts in all things, and we need to help combat the notion that that can be true, because it just simply is not. We need to use vocabulary that the public can understand, and we need to not dismiss fears, but explain to people why those fears aren't supported by everything that we know up to this point. Media has a critical role to play. They need to be better about focusing on the limitations of scientific evidence and how to interpret data. They have to make a greater effort to report things without clickbait, without bias, without misleading headlines, without omitting the fact that this was a petri dish study, or there was no causal data found, or they used a sample size of 3. That's really where the fear starts. And once that misinformation is out the door, it is so much harder to combat it. And of course, they need to seek credible experts. If you're talking about safety of a chemical product, a healthcare provider is not the person that is going to provide that information. If you're seeking how you might treat something, then we want to go to a healthcare provider. And then members of the public, you guys have a role to play too. Understand, headlines are not accurate. They're designed to drive people to their website, to click on those articles. You see something, especially if it evokes fear, cross-check it. Look at other sources. Cross-check with credible sources. Remember that just because someone has a lot of followers on social media doesn't mean that they're credible, especially if they have no relevant expertise. And if you have a visceral reaction to information, pause before you share it. Do a quick logic check. Does this make sense? Do I think that this is real? Most of the times you're going to find, no, this definitely sounds exaggerated. Misinformation is a public health crisis, and in order to combat it, we need resources. We can't continue fighting this game of whack-a-mole. We need infrastructure, we need funding, we need societal ways to combat this misinformation landscape that is really accelerating. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.